Oh my God. Okay, we're live now. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the newest episode of the Zero Budget Podcast live. I, of course, am your host, Juptej Singh. With me, as always, is my beautiful co-host, Matthew Hanks. And with us today is a very, very special guest, a candidate for the Virginia governor's seat, Lee Carter. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me. And, I Twitch stream sometimes too. And so, sometimes you hit the wrong button in OBS. I'm like, oh God, I didn't start it. I hit record instead of stream. It happens.
Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the members of our audience that may be uninitiated?
Sure. I'm Lee Carter. I'm currently a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. I'm proud to have represented the people of the 50th district for the last 4 years. So that's the city of Manassas and parts of Western Prince William County. And I'm a candidate for governor. And I don't come from a normal background for a politician, right? I'm not an attorney. I'm not wealthy. I don't have this perfectly manicured background and resume. I'm a veteran. I'm an electronics repairman. I got involved in politics because I got hurt at work in the summer of 2015. And it was that experience dealing with workers' comp that was just so horrible that I said, someone needs to fix this, right? So I started going to people that I knew that worked in and around the General Assembly and asking them, what's your plan to fix workers' comp? Nobody had a plan at all. So it was a very, I don't know if they still make people watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in high school. They did when I was a kid, but it was a very Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of thing, right? Although I realize now that movie is a cautionary tale about how much it actually sucks going into government if you're not a politician. But I stepped forward and I said, you know what, if nobody's gonna fix workers' comp, which is clearly broken, then I'm going to step forward and I'm going to, start that conversation and start doing the work to fix it. And, it's the same exact kind of thing with this fight for the governor's mansion. I'm fighting to make sure that we have a healthcare system that guarantees that everyone can see a doctor, right? Not access, not affordability, but a true guarantee that when you need to see a doctor, you can just go do it and not have to worry about the bill. I'm fighting to make sure that when we legalize cannabis, that we do it in a way that doesn't let big tobacco buy up the whole industry. And not only do we have, employee ownership in the community that's been affected by prohibition, but also we need to use the cannabis tax revenue to fund reparations for Black and Indigenous Virginians. I'm fighting to make sure that when we rebuild from COVID, from the economic crisis that we've had, that we don't just lean on the same old failed way of doing economic development, which is funneling tens of millions, hundreds of millions, in some cases, like Amazon, almost $2 billion into these massive corporations that don't pay anything back to us, that drive up the cost of housing instead of actually helping people. And, they just funnel that money into the pockets of billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Instead of doing that, I'm going to take that money, put it directly into the hands of working Virginians and say, this is the startup capital that you need to start your own employee-owned business, right? This is actually, building employee ownership, building that employee-owned sector of our economy so that we rebuild our economy in a way that we own and we operate and we make all the decisions on, not Wall Street, not investors in London and New York and Tokyo. Right. So I'm fighting for all these things because nobody else on the gubernatorial stage was.
All right. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for that. And thank you again so much for being here. To our audience members that are just joining us, we are going to try to do an audience Q&A at the end of this. Of course, depending on how many audience questions that we get. So make sure to send in your questions in chat. We have Danica, our wonderful mod, taking your questions down and sending them over to us. So if we have some good audience questions, we'll ask them over at the end. But I think, Matt, you have the first question today.
I sure do have a question. You said a lot. They all sound great. But if you could just pick your top 3 issues, what would they be?
I think that was 3, wasn't it?
Oh, what is it?
Yeah. No, I mean, the single biggest thing is, I've unlike the rest of the Democrats in this primary, I've never taken a single dime from any for-profit corporation or industry interest group, right? I never have, and I never will. All 4 of the other Democratic candidates have taken money from fossil fuel companies, All four of the other Democratic candidates have taken money from police organizations. All four of the other Democratic candidates have taken money from big banks like Capital One. Three of the other four Democratic candidates have taken money from big tobacco. And so, I'm fighting for a future for Virginia that is not dominated by these corporate special interests, right? And there's a lot of different ways that sort of gets out into policy, right? On healthcare, I'm not talking about tweaking the Affordable Care Act. I'm talking about actually making a universal healthcare system that guarantees all 8.5 million people in Virginia have healthcare, right? When it comes to housing, I'm not talking about increasing subsidies for real estate developers. I'm talking about rent control and a public option for housing, massive investment in public housing that's not tied to income levels. I'm talking about good cause eviction laws, right? I'm talking about all sorts of things that the rest of the field just isn't talking about. And the reason for that is because I'm not beholden to any of those big mega donors.
So with the not taking money from corporate donors, do you think that it's been a little bit more trouble, like kind of raising money on a public level, or have you actually found it easier to like connect with voters that way?
Yeah, I mean, so raising money has always been hard. Going back to the very start of when I ran in 2017, I've always been outspent. I've always been outspent massively. And so far, I've always been able to connect with people. When we launched this campaign on January 1st, we had huge momentum right out the gate, right? We had nearly 3,000 individual donors in the first 2 weeks. But it was tough because I'm still a legislator. We're not allowed to fundraise during the session. So when the session kicked in on, I think it was January 12th, that was it. I had to stop. Right. And then I had to try to restart again in February when the law allowed me to keep fundraising. So it has been tough. But, the thing about the Democratic primary right now is it's dominated by one big money candidate, right? Terry McAuliffe is a former governor. He's got essentially unlimited money, right? If I somehow raise $20 million, he would raise $50 million. There's absolutely no way that anybody could ever outspend Terry McAuliffe. And so, if you try to just get into a fundraising arms race against a candidate like that, you're going to lose 10 times out of 10 because he does it better, right? He has bigger donors. His people have deeper pockets. You're never going to outspend that guy. So you got to run on credibility. And that's what not taking money from corporate special interests is all about. It's about having that credibility so that you can go and talk to voters and say, when I talk about healthcare, I'm going to fight for what I say I'm going to fight for because I'm not taking any money from the insurance companies, right? When it comes to housing, it's, I'm going to fight for these things because I'm not taking money from the developers or the landlords, right? When it comes to, any number of issues, there's always a special interest group on the other side trying to screw the rest of us over. And I'm not taking their money. So you can believe that I'm on your side. I'm not just saying it.
So true. You really strike me as a very confident person. And I do mean that as a compliment. But that kind of brings up a question I had, especially regarding the last debate about you were very open to calling yourself a socialist, which may not necessarily be a popular term, especially in a place like the Commonwealth. So I guess what was going through your brain when you were thinking about that, and when you were like, what, I'm going to say it?
It's what I am. And I don't believe in hiding the ball, right? I've always campaigned on just who I am and what I believe. Frankly, I didn't even realize when I started my first House race back in 2016, I didn't realize that I was a socialist at that time, right? I'd always just kind of been to the left of the Democrats. And I always wondered, why don't they ever act right when they're actually in power? And I didn't have a reason. I didn't have an analysis for why that was. And it wasn't until Bernie Sanders went out there and he was going around the country and making these clear, convincing moral arguments that lined up, pretty neatly with the things that I always believed, calling himself a socialist, that I literally Googled what is socialism. And I just started, reading and reading and reading. And believe me, anybody who's been down this path, you know how much reading there is. But the more I read, the more I realized, like, oh, God damn it. Yes. Okay. This is, I didn't have a label for it, but this is the label that fits what I've always believed. And because I don't believe in lying to people to try to get votes, this is going to make it tough. It's going to be hard. But with me, you get exactly what's on the label, right? And what it means to be a socialist. It's a very intentionally misused term, right? For the last 100 years, people have been saying socialism is when the government does things, and the more things government does, the more socialister it is, right?
Boy,
and if government does everything, then that's communism, right? But it's not. No. So what socialism is it means that you think that the people who do the work every day should make the decisions in the workplace. That's it, right? It's taking democracy, the principle that if you are impacted by a decision, you should be at the table making that decision, and applying it to work. So the question of do you want a socialist economy or a capitalist one is really as simple as, do you want to work for someone else like you do now? Or do you want to be an owner in the business you work at? Because that's what I'm offering, right? I'm offering that everybody who goes to work for a living should be an equal part owner in the business that they work at. And, there's examples of this that actually exist. On the small scale, it could be, there's a diner out in Harrisonburg where they're all equal part owners, right? And it's a couple dozen people, and they all own one share. And every couple of weeks they come in, after they've got the customers out, clean the tables, everything, they pull out the schedule, they pull out the balance sheet, they figure out who's going to work what hours and what they're going to do with the money, right? How much of that money is going to go back into the business? How much is going to go to compensation, whether or not they need to bring on a new employee owner because they have too much work on their plate, whatever. They all make those decisions together on the small scale. And on the large scale, what it can look like is the world's largest worker cooperative. It's the Mondragon Corporation. It was started in Spain in the 1950s in a church basement, and now they have 87,000 employee owners, and they operate in 90 some odd different countries. They actually lease out some of their lab space to massive corporations like General Motors, right? And they've never had a layoff. In 70 years, they've never had a round of layoffs. Through all the economic crashes, all the economic crises that the world has been through, they've never had a round of layoffs because the CEO has to run for re-election, right? Instead of the CEO making 3,000 times what the average worker makes, like some of the big corporations that we have here in the States, their CEO makes 8 times what the average person at the company makes, which is still a lot, right? Still a lot of money. But the CEO has to run for re-election every few years among the rest of the employee owners. And so when times are tough, guess where they tighten the belt, right? Regular corporations, when times are tough, they just cut thousands of people loose. And they say, you're not our problem anymore. But not an employee-owned business. An employee-owned business says, okay, the people who have been doing the best in the good times are going to tighten their belt a little bit. And we're going to make sure that everybody gets through this. And when the economy heats back up again, we'll still have all the same employees. Everybody will still have their job. Nobody will have lost their house. Nobody will have lost their health insurance, nothing, because we're all in this together. And, that's the kind of future that I want for working Virginians. I want a future where we control our own economic destiny.
I think one of the really important things that you touched on there is that socialism, like kind of as a term, is very, very, very broad, and it encompasses like a lot of different kinds of people.
Yep.
So would you say that definition of workers owning the means of production, democracy in the workplace, would that be, is that like the extent of your brand of socialism, or would you like is there more to that we're not seeing here?
Oh, you want to get super wonky?
Let's get deep. Let's get into it.
I take a lot of inspiration from like the syndicalist tradition, which is a very sort of uniquely American political tradition. The radical industrial unionists, syndicalists, that were very big in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States. And we still have a lot of remnants of that political tradition that's still present. You can look at, there's a lot of like oddities in state government throughout the United States. If you look at North Dakota, for example, right? North Dakota has a public bank, right? They have the Bank of North Dakota. It's owned by the state government. And because of that, the Bank of North Dakota has been paying a dividend to the people of North Dakota for damn near 100 years. And when economic crises hit, North Dakota has lower eviction and foreclosure rates. They have lower rates of layoffs because they have this public bank. That public bank was created because there was this big, left-wing political movement in North Dakota over 100 years ago, where they actually created their own third party called, I think it was the Nonpartisan League. And they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get a majority in the legislature and we're going to create a public bank, and that's it. And they got a majority in the legislature and they created a public bank, and then they were gone 4 years later, but the bank still stays, right? So, you can look at, for example, Virginia law. We had all these laws about consumer cooperatives that were already on the books, but not being used. And that's because, over 100 years ago, there was a big move to have consumer cooperatives be a bigger part of the economy. And, older folks, particularly out in Southwest, they know that, like, when they were kids, when you went to the grocery store, you were going down to the co-op to get some groceries, right? But it's fallen out of favor. But they have had these lasting impacts that you just got to know where to look, right? And the history of that radical organizing, of syndicalists working both inside and outside of government for more worker power, more workplace democracy. They're not going to teach you that in history class. You got to dig that up yourself, but it's out there, and it's very distinctly American. And also French. There were a lot of French too.
That's actually where I've always heard where syndicalism came from, but that's really interesting. A lot of like socialism and syndicalism is a lot about workers. Shockingly, I don't know.
No, like if you listen to like a lot of the songs they have kindergartners sing, like a lot of that is music that came from the industrial union movement, from the syndicalists. Like pretty much anything by Woody Guthrie is distinctly anti-capitalist, and they just take all the anti-capitalist parts out and let 5-year-olds sing it, right? So like, this land is your land, right? This land is your land, this land is my land. But there's a verse in the original they don't teach to kids, which is talking about how there was a big green lawn with a sign that said private property, but on the backside the sign didn't say nothing, because this land is made for you and me, right? They don't teach kids that part.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. But you've been pretty staunchly against, right to work laws, or I think you would call them anti-labor union laws.
Yep.
However, they're quite popular in Virginia. I think it has like something like a 68% approval rating. So I guess, could you elaborate on why these right to work laws are generally not good for workers, and how would you convince said workers that it's not good for them?
So first of all, the label is very popular, right to work, but it's intentionally misleading, right? It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you have the right to actually go to work. What it is it was created in the 1940s as part of the Taft-Hartley Act. This was federal law that mandated federally that labor unions have to bargain on behalf of everybody in the workplace, whether they're members or not, right? And right to work laws are state laws that say that along with that federal requirement, the union has to bargain on behalf of everyone, whether or not they're a member. The state law says that the union also cannot get compensation for those efforts they're doing on non-members' behalf, right? So the union has to do work for people who don't pay. So that's, everything from bargaining for higher wages, better hours, safer conditions, providing employees with lawyers when they have a case against the employer, right? Like when they're hurt at work or if they've been discriminated against or something like that. The union has to do all of those things for non-members if they provide them for members, but they can't get any compensation back, right? So the non-members are getting these services for free that are paid for by the rest of the folks in their workplace. And this law was set up intentionally to do two things. One, it was to bankrupt unions, right? Obviously, if the union is required to provide a service they can't get compensation for, that's going to make it harder to keep the union afloat. It's going to make the dues higher for the people who are paying. And second, it was designed to exploit racial tensions. Now, originally, the guy that came up with this, a guy named Vance Muse, was very, very explicit that, when he said it's the right to work without joining a union, he went a step further and he said it was the right to work without joining an integrated union. He, was viciously racist. He said, all sorts of things that I'm not going to repeat. But one of the things that made it abundantly clear was he said, white men and women should not be forced to join organizations with, and then there was a long string of racial slurs referring to Black people who they'll have to call brother or else lose their job, right? That was what he said about this law that he was trying to get passed through Southern state legislatures throughout the 1940s. And so we've got this law that, intentionally makes it harder to organize a union that was designed to stoke racial tensions. And we got to get rid of it. The people of Virginia had an opportunity to vote on this, actually, in 2016. The Republicans were trying to add right to work to the Constitution. And the people of Virginia overwhelmingly rejected. They rejected it by, I think, something like an 8 or 9 point margin. And, it really should be settled that this law is garbage, right? The Democratic Party's national platform says right in it, right to work laws are wrong. The State Central Committee of the Democratic Party of Virginia unanimously passed a resolution that said that we should repeal right to work. And if you look at even some more conservative states than Virginia, like Missouri, right? Missouri on the same ballot elected a bunch of Republicans and also rejected making Missouri a right to work state by a 2-to-1 margin. Because once you get past the 3-word label, once you actually explain to people what it is, they're like, oh man, that is seriously screwed up, right? And everybody just instinctively knows that it's wrong. But the problem is we have some holdouts in the General Assembly that don't want to do the right thing. They don't want to make big business donors angry with them. They don't want to lose out on funding streams for their reelection campaigns. And because of that, we can't get this thing to a fair vote. We have Democratic majorities in both chambers. We have a Democratic governor, and I'm putting forward a bill that's part of the Democratic Party's national platform. Can't get a vote.
It's almost like a union tax or something, except there's like no penalty for not paying it, right? Like you kind of get like a benefit for not paying it, actually, like to pay your like sort of union dues, because you don't pay it, but then you still get the benefits of the union on top of that.
And the whole point of that is, these anti-union employers, they'll actually tell their employees, if there is a union in the workplace, you get all the benefits and you don't have to join, right? And the reason they do that is as soon as union density goes below 50%, right, goes to 49, call a new NLRB election, right? You're down below 50% representation. You're no longer the legitimate representative for the workers in this workplace. We don't have a union anymore.
Gotcha. Yeah. Sort of pivoting away from a lot of the union talk, I think you did a good job of laying out that issue. I think now we can talk a little more like specifically about certain policies.
Give me a second. I gotta let my cat out.
Oh, okay. No problem. We'll keep chat entertained. How you guys doing in chat?
How you guys doing in chat?
I locked my cat in here with me when I shut the door.
Oh, okay. So one of the things that you've mentioned in your opening, as well as in the debate, that I was really curious about is you said when you were when legalizing cannabis, we would use the tax revenue for that, 100% of it, to pay reparations.
Yeah.
Now, reparations is another one of those terms that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So, what would your idea of reparations be?
Well, first of all, this wouldn't sort of negate the need for the federal government to also have a reparations plan.
Sure.
This is just trying to make up for the Virginia government's complicity in a lot of the essentially the worst crimes in human history. Right? We have the genocide of Native Americans. We have the transatlantic slave trade. Redlining, Jim Crow, the war on drugs, which is still ongoing. Right? Virginia's government has taken part in a lot of these atrocities against Black and Indigenous people. And so we have a lot to make up for. And the cannabis tax revenue is going to be a couple $100 million a year. It's not going to be enough to make up 100% for everything the Virginia government has done. But it's a place to start. And it's a pretty reasonable place to start because nobody has staked a claim on that money yet, right? That's always the big pushback against a reparations plan. It's people saying, oh, why should I have to pay for something that I didn't personally do, right? Why should we take from these other projects that benefit me to do reparations? Well, there's nobody staked a claim on the cannabis tax money yet. So it's a perfect opportunity. It's a brand new revenue stream. We can start down that road. And I would create a governor's commission on reparations to find out exactly what reparations should mean. But, frankly, everything should be on the table, from grants and zero interest loans for folks in the Black and Indigenous communities to create their own businesses, to helping boost Black and Indigenous home ownership rates, to some cash grants to people that have been directly impacted by, for example, the war on drugs or redlining, people that are still living that have been directly impacted by those things. To massive investments in HBCUs, massive investments in education in those affected communities. I don't have a sort of 100% dollar for dollar where everything is going to go, because we need community input on where those dollars should go, right? But I've taken the step that no one else in Virginia politics has and said that it's something we need to do. And we have an opportunity to do it. We have a revenue stream. We got to, start the process right now.
So ideally for you, it would be both a mixture of community investment and direct cash to a lot of the families impacted by racist policies.
Yeah. And I tell you, one thing it doesn't include is more money for cops. Absolutely not. There's too many of these plans that people come up with that are like, oh, we're going to fix policing and make everything better. And it's only going to cost us another $50 million to the state police. That never works. It hasn't worked yet, right? But every few years, someone comes along with a great new plan to fix policing that somehow always involves giving them more money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That actually kind of brings me to an interesting question. I kind of actually had a discussion with a friend about this last night, but defunding the police.
Yes.
What a popular term. So defunding the police does have a bit of a kind of a trick to it, because whilst I think the term itself is quite unpopular, the ideas behind it are quite popular. If immediately if you say, oh, I want to defund the police, someone's like, no. But if you're just like, hey, I want to do X, Y, and Z, they're like, oh, okay, that sounds reasonable, because it is. But I kind of just want to what is your idea of maybe defunding the police? And how would you pitch that to people who generally are kind of off put by that?
Well, I said it on the debate stage, right? You got to go through sort of line by line of all the things that we're having police do right now and ask whether or not it makes sense to have a man with a gun doing those things, or in some cases, whether it makes sense to have anyone doing them at all, right? So, like traffic enforcement, right? You can do traffic enforcement without having a man with a gun making traffic stops. That's a dangerous situation for everyone. It's dangerous for the person being pulled over. because every interaction with an armed policeman is a potential interaction that could go south and you could get shot, right? It's actually more dangerous for the person doing it to be an armed policeman than to have, somebody unarmed with no, law enforcement capability outside of traffic laws. Because, if somebody's got something in the trunk, then, they get pulled over, they might panic, they might attack the cop. Who knows? But if you know that a traffic stop is a traffic stop is a traffic stop, and that's all it'll ever be, then it's a lot safer for everyone, right? So it doesn't make sense to have a man with a gun doing it. It doesn't make sense to have a man with a gun doing, mental health interventions, right? Someone that's having a mental health crisis does not need an armed policeman there. The armed policeman is much more likely to shoot that person than to help them. So we need to, instead of having police be the ones on the scene dealing with people that are having mental health crises, we need to have mental health counselors that are not police, that are not armed. They need to be the ones handling it. Same with substance use, right? Substance use doesn't need to be a criminal issue at all, right? Not only should it not be enforced by armed police, it shouldn't be a crime. It's a health issue. It's a medical issue. It should be handled by hospitals and doctors, not police. And, there's plenty of examples on the world stage for how you could do that better. I look at Portugal, right? Portugal's opioid death rate is 13 times lower than ours. Ours is like, in Virginia, last time I checked, it was like 38 per 100,000 people per year. Portugal's was 3. And it's because they legalized possession of all drugs. They just said, this is no longer a criminal issue, right? We're not going to have retail sales of heroin. That would be ridiculous. But we're also not going to lock you up for having a needle, right? We're going to get you the help that you need. And it's actually helped people get out of addiction. It's helped people not die. And it's reduced violence, actually, because keeping drugs illegal and, violently enforcing that prohibition creates a funding stream for organized crime, right? So if you decriminalize or legalize, then all of a sudden that funding stream is gone. These criminal organizations don't have, these supply chains to fight over and kill each other over, right? So there's just all sorts of benefits to it. Same thing with sex work, right? I don't think sex work should be illegal. I think it should be decriminalized. We're not talking about the Nordic model where it's legal for the sex worker, but illegal for the John, because there's all sorts of problems with that too, where, essentially the sex workers are still vulnerable to police confiscating the money that they've gotten. But it should just be decriminalized, because that way, sex workers are no longer vulnerable to exploitation. They're no longer vulnerable to human trafficking. They're no longer, being rounded up by the cops for their own good. There's just, all sorts of benefits to not having the police enforce that. And also, we don't have to spend the money to do it. And it makes people safer. Right. So that's what defunding the police is all about. It's finding ways to make people safer by taking law enforcement out of the equation in places that don't need to be a part of the equation.
So kind of with that note of some people say we need more money. A lot of those kinds of proposals are things like body cams, accountability boards, more training, which to their credit does cost more money. How would you make sure that the money that we do reallocate from the police goes towards those better measures of accountability and towards kind of fixing policing, quote unquote?
Well, we had a special session in 2020 about the issue of police violence. And this was actually a hotly contested issue, was whether the reforms that we were passing were going to be implemented out of existing funds or whether they had new money that came along with them. And unfortunately, the General Assembly decided they needed to have more money to go along with them. I mean, we increased the state police budget by something like 8 or 9% in a special session to deal with the problem of police violence. Right? How do you come out of a special session on police violence giving the police more money? and giving police officers a pay raise and cash bonuses of $2,000. Like how in the world does that make any sense? But there's all sorts of increased accountability measures, different training that yeah, you can implement them, but you got to make sure that we're not increasing the budget to go on with them. And you also can't think that just giving the police more rules to follow is going to fix the problem, right? You've got to actually do the hard work of reducing police interactions entirely, like reducing the size and scope of police. And sort of the cautionary tale for this model that we've been using of saying, oh, police can't do chokeholds anymore, and we're going to count on the police to enforce that. And we're also going to train them how not to do it, right? The cautionary tale on that is Minnesota. Minnesota has been at the epicenter of the protests against police violence because of the murders of George Floyd and Daunte Wright. But there were these sort of 8 reforms that were proposed after George Floyd's murder. Minneapolis had already implemented 7 of them, right? And Brooklyn Center, the next town over, had already implemented all 8. George Floyd and Daunte Wright are still dead. So clearly those reforms that just tell the police, you have to be nicer, you have to follow the rules better, you can't use a chokehold, you can't do whatever, clearly they're not enough to keep people safe. We have to dig deeper. We have to get into real discussions of what police should and should not be doing as part of the job, not just creating new guidelines for them to do the existing job.
This next one is just a question that I'm always curious to hear, especially like socialist answer on this. So do you consider police officers to be a part of the proletariat? Why not?
Because they're the ones that enforce everything that we're fighting against. They are like, if workers go on strike and, take, for example, a sit-down strike, which there's a long history of sit-down strikes in the United States. They've been tremendously effective. That's why they're illegal now. But a sit-down strike is where workers go to work and then just sit at their station and refuse to work until their demands are met. But by sitting there, they also refuse to allow themselves to be replaced, right? Which is why it's so effective. Mm-hmm. But it's the police that come in and arrest people. It's the police that come in and drag them away. It's the police that violently enforce the employer's desire to replace the striking workers. So it's very, very clear that police are not a part of the working class, just based on what the goal of the job is. The goal of the job of everyone in the working class is to produce something. The goal of police is to keep the rest of us producing.
Mm-hmm.
That was a really interesting take. I know Joe Chester's dying to ask that.
I'm always so interested to hear what people have to say, because there's so many different answers to that question. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah. And if you look at like Southwest Virginia, if you look at Southern West Virginia, the coal country region, there's a very long history, which again is not taught in history classes. There's a very long history that demonstrates that the police are not on the side of the workers, because 100 years ago, when coal miners went on strike in Southwest Virginia and Eastern Kentucky and Southern West Virginia, the coal companies would call the cops out, and the cops would shoot at the workers, right? They called them mine wars, where the striking miners would take up arms and form a militia to defend themselves from the cops, right? And so there's still people living in that region who granddaddy was a part of the mine wars, or great grandfather was part of the mine wars, and it's this like family history, but there's just there's no sort of mainstream political outlet for people who have that kind of radical working class we're going to have our demands met, and we're going to defend ourselves when the cops come. Like there's nobody to vote for those folks.
Well, again, I appreciate the answer. I think it's really insightful and interesting. We only have one more question before we have some Q&A, if you would mind. This last question, I think, is on a lot of people's mind. It's viability. It comes up a lot with progressive Democrats. It's like always usually the number one question. We saw this back in 2020, especially when Bernie was running. Everyone was just like, will he be able to beat Trump? The answer was probably, but besides the point. Does this prospect of voters not seeing you as a realistic candidate ever come into your campaign, and like how do you address that?
It's the single biggest challenge for the left in electoral politics, specifically in Democratic primaries, right? When left candidates actually make it to a general election, they overperform every single time, right? But somehow there's still this perception out there in Democratic primaries that, if you go with this guy that's saying popular things, he's somehow going to be unpopular in November, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it is the mainstream thought within the Democratic Party. And I think what it comes down to is that the will to do good things has been beaten out of the Democratic Party, particularly in the 70s and 80s, right? When you look, everybody's afraid of being the next George McGovern, right? Everybody's afraid of being the next Walter Mondale. Everybody's afraid of being the next Mike Dukakis. But we're not in the 70s and 80s anymore, right? We are in a completely new era where we have two whole generations of people now, millennials like myself and Generation Z, that are coming into adulthood with very few economic prospects. Our life expectancy is shorter than that of our parents, right? Housing costs are through the roof. Education costs are through the roof. Healthcare costs are through the roof, and our wages are not going up. So we have two whole massive generations of voters who desperately need change, who feel it every time they log into their bank app. Or hell, in my case, when I'm afraid to log into my bank app because I know what the answer is going to be, right? And there is this train of thought within the Democratic Party that it's still 40 years ago, and that we can't take a chance by giving those people who are struggling what they actually need in a candidate. And it's incredibly frustrating. I cannot tell you the number of rooms that I've been in where I've talked about my plans, where I've talked about my policies, where I've talked about how I will do things differently as governor. And the entire room has sat there going, yeah, that sounds great. But no. Why? Well, because November, right? But Virginia's a blue state, right? Yeah, there are very, very few possible futures where a Republican wins in November. And me as the nominee is not one of those possible futures where a Republican wins, right? Me as a nominee essentially guarantees, in my view, that the Democrat wins by an overwhelming margin, and that we pick up seats in the General Assembly in places the Democratic Party doesn't see as competitive. Because I'm not only talking to, the same voters that vote for Democrats every single time. I'm talking to new folks. I'm talking to people who have become disillusioned with politics, who don't see the point in showing up because they don't think that anybody is actually going to fix things, right? So I'm adding to the vote total that a generic Democrat would get, and convincing primary voters that that's the case is the single biggest challenge that we face.
All right. Well, thank you once again for coming on. Now's the portion where we'll go to audience questions. Fortunately, we do have a lot of audience questions, but that does mean that, of course, just because you sent in a question doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be asked. But go ahead and continue sending in your questions, and if they're bangers, we'll make sure that they're asked. Okay. The first one, has to do a little bit about the unfortunate shooting that happened in Spotsylvania, and of course the behavior of Richmond and state police throughout the Black Lives Matter protests. How do you plan to reform Richmond police and state police? And what sort of policies would you implement to hold them accountable?
Well, it's actually deeply personal for me. On May 30th last year, at the very start of the protests, I was actually in the middle of moving my apartment, right, from the 4th floor of my building to the 5th. And my phone started blowing up, and it was, friends, constituents, who were saying, they were calling me, they were sending me texts and DMs saying, you got to get down here to the corner of Sudley and Sudley Manor on the other side of town, because the cops are tear gassing people. They're firing rubber bullets. They're brutalizing protesters. So you got to come down here. So I did. And on the way, I called someone from the Prince William County Board of Supervisors, asked him what was going on. He got me in touch with the Prince William County Police. They straight up told me, we don't even have tear gas, right? So I said, all right, well, I'm on the way. I'm going to find out what's going on, because what you're telling me is not lining up with what my constituents are telling me. And I need to know what's happening. So radio ahead, tell your officers I'm coming and I have questions. So they did. They radioed ahead, right? I get down there. There was a patrol officer that was blocking off traffic a couple of blocks away. I had him radio ahead as well to let them know that I was there and I was going to be walking up. And so, I walked a couple of blocks, I get there, and the first thing I notice is the smell of tear gas. And I know tear gas very, very well, right? The Marine Corps made sure I know what tear gas smells like. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, George W. Bush's tear gas and Ralph Northam's tear gas taste exactly the same. But instantly, I knew that these cops lied to me. They said they didn't even have tear gas. So I get up there and I identify myself. I hold up my ID. I say, I'm a member of the General Assembly. You were told I was coming. I want to talk to whoever's in charge. I have some questions. And instead of answering, they pointed a rifle at me, held me there for 92 seconds in silence with a rifle aimed at me. And the only acknowledgement that I was there beyond the barrel of a rifle pointed at my chest was a flashbang grenade that went off at my feet, right? So not only did they lie to me, but they were so violently resistant to any kind of oversight that instead of answering a basic question like who's in charge, they decided to attack a legislator on camera. And that turned it into like a 2-hour long standoff. And through the course of those 2 hours, I'm standing between the police and my constituents, and I'm hearing them on the radio constantly, we need to get around this guy. We need to start rounding people up. They were talking on the radio about making mass arrests. And the whole time I'm asking basic questions, right? What public safety reason is there for you to be here? Who's in charge here? Is that body camera on? What's your name? I didn't get a single answer for any of these questions. And through those 2 hours, they threw 2 flashbang grenades at me. They launched a third one from a grenade launcher at me. They hit me with shields twice and pepper sprayed me. And still no answers for any of it. Absolutely no justification for why they were attacking people in the middle of Sudley Road. None. Right? No accountability. I'm fairly certain it was the Virginia State Police that threw those flashbang grenades at me and pepper sprayed me, but I don't know for sure because they've never answered. Right? I still don't know the names of the officers that were involved. I still don't know if the body cameras were on that day. I have no idea. So we have a very serious problem of law enforcement that sees any kind of oversight, any kind of accountability, any kind of transparency as a threat, and they react to it with violence. So number one, the very first thing I'll do as governor, and this is, strictly to guarantee my own safety is the reason it's the first thing, is we've got to audit the state police and the Capitol Police and make sure that anybody who holds those kinds of attitudes about accountability and transparency is gone. Make sure that anybody who has any kind of sympathy or ties to white supremacist or right-wing extremist movements, gone, right? They've got to be gone on day one or as close as possible to day one. And then once we're done with those audits of the state police and Capitol Police, then we're going to have the state police do those audits on local law enforcement agencies throughout the Commonwealth. And it's not going to be optional, right? The governor can't directly force local law enforcement agencies to do audits like that. But the governor can say that if you don't do it, you don't get your 599 funding. And so I'm going to make that 599 funding contingent on getting rid of anyone with white supremacist ties from your organization. And that shouldn't be a controversial thing, but it is. So that's step one. But, ultimately what it comes down to is police should not ever be an occupying force in our communities. And they are. Anytime there's any kind of left-wing protest, anytime there's any kind of protest for racial justice, you always see a line of riot cops with a tank behind them. Every single time, right? Dressed out, military fatigues, military body armor, names blacked out, no identification. And there's no way to look at that and see anything other than an occupying force. It's got to stop.
Really well said.
I did a Twitter thread on this a few days ago, where essentially it's kind of it's hard to make the argument that the police, especially when they're in riot gear, are anything other than exactly the kind of standing army that the framers of the Constitution wanted to prohibit, right? Because if you look at, for example, what the British Army was doing in the colonies prior to 1776, right? They were, they were essentially law enforcement. The redcoats were acting as riot cops. The Boston Tea Party is a perfect example, right? The Boston Tea Party was a protest that involved property destruction. They stormed the ship that was owned by the British East India Company, and they threw the tea overboard into the harbor. And it caused what today would be millions of dollars worth of damage. And the British government's response was exactly the same thing that Florida is doing now. They, first of all, curtailed the right to assembly, right? Florida just passed a law in response to the Black Lives Matter protests that says that you can't protest in groups of 3 or more. There's no way that's constitutional, but they're going to enforce it for a while before a court throws it out. But it's exactly what the British government did, right? They also passed a law, the British did, that said that colonial authorities, the local governments at the time, were to be held financially liable for any property damage at a protest, which is exactly what Florida just passed. Florida passed a law that said if your local government doesn't violently crack down on a protest, then the local government has to repay the state for any property damage. Literally exactly the same thing that King George III did. And the British also passed a law that said that if a British soldier killed someone at a protest in America, that they would be tried in England, where they knew that it would be a lot easier for that person to get away with it. And many states, including Florida, have recently passed laws that say that essentially, if you run over a protester and kill them with your car, that you're not criminally liable for that. So there's no way to disconnect the kinds of anti-protest legislation, the kinds of things that are being passed at the request of the police. There's no way to detach that from the kind of things that, you know, the Americans actually rebelled against when George III did them. It's exactly the same things.
So true. Once again, I mean, yeah, it is very interesting, like how we kind of like look to our revolutionary past and we're just like, yes, so true. But then it's just like when we see the same thing play out, it's just like, whoa, buddy, what are you?
Right.
What are you, a Connie? Like, you know. I know we said we only had you till 8, but I mean, if you want to answer some more questions, we got some more questions. But
yeah.
All right. I just wanted to make sure, just so we didn't like hold you here hostage. Here's another simple audience question. What is your advice to people with little to no experience in politics interested for running for public office?
Go into it with your eyes open. It's gonna suck. You know, I'm not in office because I find it fun. It's not. It's an incredibly frustrating job. You know, I'm beating my head against the wall day in and day out, trying to convince some of the most powerful people in Virginia that good things are good and bad things are bad. You know, things that like an 8-year-old would understand are bad. I'm having to try to convince these people. And while I'm doing it, you know, I also have assassination threats that come in pretty frequently. Right? People threatening to murder me all the time. So I'm not doing this because it's fun. I'm doing this because it's the only way I can sleep at night. I'm the kind of person, if I see an injustice, I have to fight against it. Now, if I fight and I lose, okay, you know, I'd clearly rather win. But if I fight, if I give it everything I've got and I lose, I can go to sleep that night. I can look at myself in the mirror. But if I see an injustice and I just let it go when I had the ability to do something about it, that's going to tear me up for the rest of my life. Right? That's the kind of thing that I'm going to look back on 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and say, man, oh, yeah, that was a mistake. I really regret doing that. And so that's my advice to people that want to run for office, particularly people that are motivated by a desire for justice to run for office, is don't do it because you think it's going to be fun. Do it because you are called to help people.
All right. Bare Bones, thank you for your question. They say, Mr. Carter, what is your plan to combat rural decay and help build up our rural communities? And how do you see a Lee governorship affecting the party divide between urban and rural Virginia?
So I'm from a small town originally, Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which you might have seen in the news the past couple of days because they had a high-profile police shooting less than 24 hours after the George Floyd verdict was read out. They had a Pasquotank County Sheriff's Department that was serving a search warrant and shot and killed a man who was in his car driving away. All right. But I'm from that small town, population 17,000. It's the biggest thing for an hour in any direction. So I know exactly what's happening in these small towns, these rural communities, which is, you know, they used to have businesses that were sort of pillars of the local economy. And the local government said, you know, we got to have Walmart come in, we got to have Family Dollar come in because they're going to create jobs. And instead, what they did was they created competition that drove all those existing businesses out of town. And, you know, when Walmart and Family Dollar come in, everyone else boards up the windows and they're done. And everyone that doesn't work at Walmart and Family Dollar loses their jobs. So we've got to fight back against that. We've got to, first of all, stop subsidizing those big corporations. But second, we've got to create the resources for people in rural communities to create their own employee-owned enterprises, right? We're never going to be able to get massive corporations to come into a rural community to do anything other than extract wealth. So we've got to build from the ground up. And we've got to make sure that it's the people that live there, that work there, that own the businesses that are the pillars of that community, right? Make sure those dollars are staying there. Make sure that they're circulating within the community over and over and over again. That's the only way that we're going to be able to bring back the rural economy. Agricultural policy also has to be a big part of it. We've let our small farmers, our family farmers, be trampled over by big agribusiness, especially the distributors, right? The distributors say, the only thing that I'm going to buy from you is soybeans, and I'm going to buy them at X number of cents per bushel. No room for negotiation. If you don't sell to me at that price, I'll find someone else who will, and you just won't have anyone to buy your crop, right? And so, it's it's called monopsony power, right? As opposed to monopoly. A monopoly is when there's only one seller. A monopsony is when there's only one buyer, right? So we've got to take on the monopsony agricultural distributors. We've got to give farmers, small farmers, family farmers, and cooperatively owned farms new ways to sell what they're growing, right? So we've got to create, first of all, expand our nutrition assistance programs, especially school meals, right? This is a great way to help the rural economy, is through the school meal program, right? We've got hungry kids here in Virginia, and we can feed them with sustainably grown, healthy, small farmer produced, Virginia grown food, right? So we can just create conditions, right? Set conditions for schools to purchase that, they have to purchase from small farmers. They have to purchase from cooperatively owned farms. They have to purchase from sustainable farms, whatever, right? We can also create subsidies, retail subsidies, as opposed to producer subsidies, but create retail subsidies for produce that carries the Virginia's Finest label, and tighten down on the criteria for what Virginia's Finest means, which should include a measure of sustainability, and it should mean that it's not grown by big agribusiness, right? But we've also got to make sure that farmers have more opportunities to sell directly to the public through farmers markets, through CSAs, community supported agriculture, which is where they deliver to a customer base, through direct placement in grocery retailers instead of going through the distributors. There's all kinds of things that we can do to get more money into the hands of rural communities that have secondary benefits as well, like, I don't know, feeding people, right? We just got to do it. These problems are not logistical. These problems are political. The problem is that, your Walmarts, your Family Dollars, your Monsantos, your John Deeres, right? They have tremendous political power within the General Assembly. So we've got to be willing to take them on and tell them that you cannot run roughshod over rural communities anymore.
Just a real quick follow-up question to that. When you say like building up worker-owned companies in rural areas as opposed to subsidizing corporations, on a policy level, how would you implement that? Subsidizing those worker-owned companies, and then how would you, again, on a policy level, like encourage the growth and the building of those worker-owned? Because worker-owned, like worker co-ops and stuff like that, aren't like the primary. They're not really in a lot of people's like conscious eye, and especially I would imagine in rural communities.
Right. Yeah. So first of all, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year on conventionally owned, investor-owned businesses, right? So step one is stop giving them that unfair advantage over Virginia worker-owned businesses, right? That's number one. Number two, I'd prefer to actually reverse it, right? Take the money that we're currently giving to big business and give that money to people who want to start worker-owned businesses instead, right? But also, Virginia's government and local governments are an incredible potential revenue stream for them, right? So if we give worker-owned businesses priority in state and local government contracts, if we give them a competitive edge in, in any kind of public procurement, then all of a sudden there's, not only are we, allowing people to start their own businesses, but essentially they have a built-in customer that's never going to go away. And that's something that's incredible for the economic stability of a community, right? So, it can be any kind of business. I don't particularly care, what industry you're in, as long as it ain't fossil fuels. There's some way that Virginia's government is buying that service, right? So if it's, office cleaners, right? Currently, Virginia's government will contract out to like a made-for-hire company to do office cleaning, and the actual cleaners who come in and do the work are making basically minimum wage, while the executives and the owners of that business are making big bucks off of that government contract, right? If we give priority for that cleaning contract to an employee-owned cleaning service, then the people who are doing the work every day get 100% of the money that they're working for, right? If it's making, signs for bus stops, right? Instead of having some investor-owned sign factory elsewhere do it, we can have a worker-owned, Virginia sign maker do it. And that money stays in Virginia and it goes directly into the hands of the person who made the sign, right? Anything that state government does that we currently contract out to other people can be done with a contract to a worker-owned business. And that's, tens of billions of dollars every year that can go directly into building worker ownership.
I really like the idea of, especially of like keeping like, Virginia money in Virginia. It sounds crazy, but I guess,
right.
Yeah. While we're kind of on the top of like workers and stuff, Invader DJ asked, how do we fight the decades and centuries of anti-worker and anti-socialist rhetoric? It feels like we make bites at the problem and have influence online, but translating that to actual change seems difficult.
So it's tough. That's been one of the biggest challenges that I've been facing is breaking through that wall, right? Breaking through that barrier of things that people have been told about socialism that are not true. So really, you gotta drill down to what it means for the direct impacts on a person's life, right? So it means you'll have healthcare, right? It means that you will have a business where you're not just a worker, you're an owner. It means that your housing costs are going to go down, and you're going to be able to afford a place that's closer to where you work, and you won't have to sit, for 2.5 hours in traffic every day, right? You break it down to what it means, and then you say at the end, and by the way, that's what socialism is going to do for you, right? And so that's kind of how you get around, because if you lead with, I'm a socialist and this is what I'm going to do, then they just say, oh, you're a socialist, right? But if you lead with, this is what I'm going to do, and then you close it out with, and I'm going to do it because I'm a socialist, it's a lot easier. But ultimately, I think what it takes is, it's not like one political leader that's going to be able to get this done. What it's going to take is thousands and thousands and thousands of Virginians creating their own worker co-ops, right? Tapping into that entrepreneurial spirit that the right loves to talk about, but doing it in a way that is equitable and that is, owned by the community, owned by the workers, And the more people that we have whose livelihoods are actually dependent upon worker ownership, the more of a base there is for a political movement in favor of worker ownership, right? Because that's like the biggest way that capitalists wield power over people currently is, they say, oh, you can't raise the minimum wage. If you do, I'm going to shut down my factory and leave, right? They hold people's livelihoods over their head. And they say, no, if you fight for better, actually, I'm going to make sure it gets worse, right? So we got to get people out of that situation where there's that leverage that can be held over their head. Once that leverage isn't being held over their head anymore, and especially once they see their neighbors doing well with worker ownership, they're going to want it for themselves. That's how we actually build out this movement. That's how we win in the long run.
On the same vein of unionism, Dozen T has a pretty interesting question. Are you letting your staff, like your campaign staff, unionize like Sanders did?
Yeah. So in 2019, my re-election campaign for the House was the first campaign in Virginia history to be unionized. My staff organized through UFCW Local 400. And when they said that they wanted to do it for the gubernatorial race, great idea. So yeah, we've been in talks with Local 400. I have recognized the bargaining unit, and I am actually, I think, waiting on the local to get back to me with a signed version of the collective bargaining agreement, but we're very, very close to having an actual collective bargaining agreement. So yes, my campaign is run by UFCW union members.
And our last question here, because we don't want to hold you hostage for too long. I know we're like 20 minutes over our original time, but again, thank you for being here. This question is about us, so I'm going to ask it because we're selfish here. What inspired you, Danica asks, what inspired you to do this interview? And how does the influence of smaller but local streamers benefit you personally and or politically? Thank you.
I'm going to level with you. My campaign manager said, hey, there's this local podcast and they want to have you on. You're going to do it. So I just went, okay. Because, the life of a political candidate is run by Google Calendar, right? The candidate doesn't ask questions. The candidate just appears where they're told and does the interviews that they're told to do.
Well, hey, your campaign manager sounds like an awesome person.
Yeah, I like to compare him to Gandalf, right? I don't know if y'all are Lord of the Rings fans, but I don't understand the magic that he does, but he disappears into the wilderness and comes back at dawn on the 5th day and wins elections for me. So I'm not going to question it.
Since that was a bit of a shorter answer, you mind if we have one more question?
Go ahead.
All right, cool. Final one, okay? Electoralism is important, but what can and should socialists and leftists be doing right now to build power outside of running for public office?
Start your own worker cooperatives. If you're in Virginia, I have laid that groundwork for you. It is a legally recognized type of business now because I passed House Bill 55 last year, right? You can do it. All it takes is 5 people and a little bit of paperwork. Create your own worker cooperatives. That's the single biggest thing that you can do for the socialist movement, is making sure that you're not beholden to a boss during the day anymore. You got to get yourself out from under the boss's thumb. It's like I wrote an article about this. I think it was like June of last year, titled the Professional Revolution. And what I argued in that article was the reason that the left has such a hard time, the reason that all of our gains are essentially temporary, is because we're not building a base of owners in our movement, right? And so all of the things that we're doing politically, we're doing on our own time, right? So we essentially have to work both for and against the boss, right? If you have a normal job where you're working for a for-profit company, you're spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week for the other guy, right? You're working for the other guy primarily. And then in your off time, you get to spend maybe 10, 15 hours on political activism, on fighting back against him. But you've already worked for him for 40 or 50 hours, right? We got to break that. We have to have economic institutions, right? Businesses that we own, that we operate, so that every hour of every day, every dollar that we make goes into our movement instead of working for someone else. Because you can't fight someone that you're working for. You got to be able to work for yourself while you're fighting for yourself.
Sounds like Juptej. We need to make zero budget podcasts.
Worker co-op.
We need to get 3 other people. Make it real quick.
I would much prefer to be the capitalist overlord looming over all my little minions.
But that's the thing about a worker cooperative. There is no overlord and there are no minions, right? Everybody is a worker and everybody is a boss, right? So there's nobody that's kind of, subordinate to any other. You all have equal decision-making authority. You all have equal power within the workplace. And it's better all around. I mean, study after study after study shows people are happier when they are a worker owner as opposed to just an employee. They're more satisfied with life. They live longer on average. And they're more productive, right? Employee-owned businesses are more productive than investor-owned businesses. But investor-owned businesses get all the subsidies. They get all the tax breaks. They get all the benefits from the government. That means that they're able to outcompete. So I'm doing what I can to level that playing field and make sure that you're not being outcompeted by investor-owned businesses, but you've got to actually do the work of creating the alternative.
Yeah.
I can't do that for you.
Yeah. Thank you so much once again, Lee Carter, for coming on. Thank you again to everybody in chat for staying with us this whole time and listening. This has been the Zero Budget Podcast. Lee, do you want to say any final words to the audience before we depart?
Remember, y'all, an injury to one of us is an injury to all of us. And I want to leave you with the words of Eugene Victor Debs, right? Eugene Debs is a guy who ran for president 4 times on the Socialist Party ticket, including he ran from prison once. And at his sentencing hearing, when he was being locked away for opposing World War I, he said to the judge, "Your Honor, long ago, I recognized my connection with every living thing on this earth. And so I say to you now that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I shall not be free." We are all in this together, folks. Every single one of us. We got to get free together.
All right. Thank you once again so much. This was a really good interview. Hopefully we can have you on again when you're on that November ballot. Really, really genuinely do appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right. If you're in chat, stick around. We're still going to be live streaming after this. But yeah, once again, thank you. Thank you everybody for listening to the newest episode of the Zero Budget Podcast live. Have a good one.